Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of Strange Origins. I wanted to start off this episode by sharing an experience of mine that I had not too long ago, and I'm sure that some of you will relate. On April 17th, 2020, on a Friday night, a few family members and myself witnessed a strange string of lights speed across the sky. They followed one right after the other, about 30 or so, and they seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was such a strange occurrence that we decided to call my brother, who checked to see if any aircrafts had been reported in the sky that night. When he didn't bring any new information to the table, we all began to theorize as to what this fleet of lights were. While at first we thought aliens, as one does, we landed on the theory that it may be government aircrafts, though the likelihood of that seemed low. Later we received a text from my brother about similar sightings. Apparently others had witnessed these dots and were told that they were simply just satellites, owned by the private spaceflight company SpaceX. These satellites were created to help bring low-cost internet to remote locations. Someday the company even hopes to fly out 30,000 satellites, though as of January 2020, only 2,000 orbit the Earth. While I confess to knowing next to nothing about how satellites work, something felt off about this experience. All of the satellites I had ever seen didn't move quite like these lights did. From what we saw in the 10 minutes that this occurred, at least 3 of these lights darted in and out of sight, and even moved backwards at an incredible speed. I'm mostly positive that these lights were what people said they were, SpaceX satellites, but at the same time, something felt off about them. When many often discard strange facts as something imagined, we have to always be trusting our gut instinct when it comes to things like this. So, in honor of my experience this week, I wanted to delve into a subject that I'm sure a few of you have experiences with: UFOs. UFO stands for Unidentified Flying Object. So, by definition, anything that flies that is unidentified is a UFO, which means that they don't exactly have to be flying saucers to be categorized as such. As you'll learn later on in the episode, a term that seems so universally used these days, flying saucer, is a style of UFO that didn't even come into fashion until about 70 years ago. The first UFO sighting was reported around 1440 BC, long before the invention of satellites or other flying technology. And while bright lights have existed in the skies for as long as the universe has existed, we know for certain that those objects adhere to certain rules. And what makes UFOs so fascinating is that they, time and time again, bend and break those rules, sometimes for what seems like no reason at all, but more often than not, with a purpose in mind. Before I delve in, I want to let you know that I will be doing more episodes on this topic. The subject of extraterrestrials is an extensive one. Even just alien sightings and abductions is an episode all on its own, not to mention the Patreon exclusive content I will be releasing that goes over specific stories, such as the Barney and Betty Hill abduction. So while I lay a groundwork of essential knowledge down in this first episode, be assured that there is more to come. Now, let's dive headfirst into the history of the UFO. As I mentioned, the first sighting of a UFO was recorded in 1440 BC. While many do believe in this as being the earliest event recorded in history of a UFO appearing in the sky, please do keep in mind that the validity of this claim is highly disputed even to this day. The event was found in a document called the Tully Papyrus, named after Alberto Tully, a Vatican museum director who lived in the early 1900s. The reason its credibility is questioned is due to the fact that the original papyrus cannot to this day be found or therefore authenticated, making the translation of the piece very likely to have been misinterpreted. But in my opinion, this fact only adds flavor to the story, as a lot of ufologists believe that the validity of UFO stories are being purposefully messed with in order to further cover up the existence of aliens, which is why I decided to include this story. The history of the papyrus states that Alberto Tulli, on a trip to Cairo in 1933, discovered the papyrus in an antique shop. Unable to buy it because of its high price tag, he made a copy of the contents. After that, a Prince Boris Derechowitz, an Italian-Russian Egyptologist, then attempted to translate what Tulli had scribbled that day. The papyrus, which had a few gaps from age, reads as follows. In the year 2020, on the 3rd month of winter, 6th hour of the day, among the scribes of the House of Life, it was found that a strange fiery disk was coming in the sky. It had no head. The breath of its mouth emitted a foul odor. Its body was 1 rod in length and 1 rod in width. It had no voice. It came toward His Majesty's house. Their heart became confused through it, and they fell upon their bellies. They went to the king to report it. His Majesty ordered that the scrolls located in the House of Life be consulted. His Majesty meditated on all these events which were now going on. After several days had passed, they became more numerous in the sky than ever. They shined in the sky more than the brightness of the sun, and extended to the limits of the 4 supports of heaven. Powerful was the position of the fiery discs. The army of the king looked on, with His Majesty in their midst. It was after the evening meal when the discs ascended even higher in the sky to the south. Fish and other volatiles rained down from the sky, a marvel never before known since the foundation of the country. And His Majesty caused incense to be bought to appease the heart of Amun-Re, the god of the 2 lands, and it was ordered that the event be recorded for His Majesty in the annals of the House of Life, to be remembered forever. For the next 1,500 years, recorded UFO sightings were scarce and regarded today as most likely natural phenomena. An example of this is from 1218 BC to 43 BC, just before the beginning of the Roman Empire, when a slew of incidences were reported. It's interesting to note that these objects were described as, quote, weapons, or, quote, fleets of ships that gleamed or lit up the sky. It does seem strange, though, that these events were seen as a military threat. One person even stated that what he saw was a, quote, spectacle of defensive and offensive weapons, end quote, that was, quote, seen to rise from the earth to the sky with a clashing noise, end quote. Historian Cassius Dio in 196 AD reported a strange event that involved what many refer to as angel hair. This substance, which has supposedly been found near where several UFO sightings occurred, including ones in the 1950s in France and Italy, is said to be jelly or cobweb-like. One of the weirder things about this substance is that it disappears from existence in a short amount of time after it falls to Earth. To this day, angel hair is linked to not only the appearance of UFOs, but also manifestations of the Christian Virgin Mary, which I would love to get into more in a later episode. Cassius Dio reported that one day, quote, a fine rain resembling silver descended from a clear sky upon the forum of Augustus, end quote. He used some of the materials to plate some of his bronze coins, but by the 4th day, the silvery coating was gone. In 1235 AD, the first investigation into the cause of UFO-like phenomena was made in Japan. An officer in the army, General Yoritsume, and his men were settled one night at camp when the men and himself saw a fleet of lights move with, quote, amazing aerobatic movements, such as circling endlessly and flying in loops, end quote. The general ordered a scientific inquiry into the show of lights. What the scientists reported back was that what they had witnessed that night was perfectly normal. They told the general that, quote, "It is only the wind making the stars sway," end quote. About 200 years later, in the mid-1500s, the people of Nuremberg, Germany witnessed what they described as, quote, "an aerial battle followed by the appearance of a large black triangular object, and then a large crash outside of the city," end quote. It's thought by some today that this was a war between UFOs in the sky. Scientists believe it to have been a sundog, which is when two bright spots appear on one or two sides of the sun, making it look as if 2 or 3 suns exist side by side. Though, after reading over the description of sundogs, something still seems off with this explanation, especially seeing as the report claimed that, quote, "witnesses observed hundreds of spheres, cylinders, and other odd-shaped objects that moved erratically overhead," end quote. Strangely enough, 5 years later in 1566, similar events occurred above Basel, Switzerland. While at first I was inclined to believe that what historians had noted sounded a lot like a solar eclipse, these events happened on 3 separate occasions during the summer of 1566, and solar eclipses are known to only happen in one place about every 400 years or so. The report stated that, quote, "after the sun had shone warm on the clear, bright skies, around 9 p.m. it suddenly took a different shape and color. First the sun lost all its radiance and luster, and it was no bigger than the full moon, and finally it seemed to weep tears of blood, and the air behind him went dark," end quote. About a century later, North America turned into a hotbed of activity. Even before the United States was the United States, it seemed that settlers from afar had their fair share of strange things happening to them when they stepped onto dry land in North America. A Puritan man from 1639 named John Winthrop wrote down in his journal that 3 English settlers had come across a great light in the night sky while rowing a boat in swampland. Winthrop wrote that, quote, "when it stood still, it flamed up and was about 3 yards square, and that, quote, when it ran, it was contracted into the figure of a swine," end quote. After 2 or 3 hours, the light began to move, and, quote, "ran as swift as an arrow," end quote. The light jumped from the men to the village of Charleston about 2 miles away, and was even bright enough that the other people from the village witnessed the light. The strangest part about this experience was the fact that the men lost time. None of them had any memory of rowing upstream, which seems to be a common occurrence of UFO abductions or even sightings. 200 years after that, and halfway across the world, an incident referred to as Utsurabune, meaning hollow ship in English, occurred in the Hitachi province of East Japan. The story goes that in 1803, local fishermen reportedly witnessed a strangely shaped vessel floating in the water. When they decided to investigate further, they found what they described as, quote, "a beautiful young woman," end quote. She had red and white hair and was dressed in unfamiliar clothing. The fishermen said that, quote, "she held a square box that no one was allowed to touch," end quote. When the men brought her on land, they noticed that she spoke to them in an unfamiliar language. After a while, they returned her to the vessel she had been floating in. Whether she asked to be returned or not, I don't know. She was never seen again. While historians and ethnologists believe this experience to be simple folklore, those from the UFO community believe it to be an extraterrestrial visitation. If you're interested, be sure to check out my Instagram page at Strange Origins Podcast to see a drawing of the ship made in 1844, and which looks strangely a lot like modern versions of flying saucers. The 20th century is when UFO sightings and talk of extraterrestrials truly became popular, hitting its golden era in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. It was actually during World War II that pilots began referring to strange orbs of light as Foo Fighters, which is where the band founded by Dave Grohl got its name. It was also in the 1940s that the US government's official search for UFOs began. An amateur pilot, Kenneth Arnold, stated that he witnessed, quote, 9 crescent-shaped objects fall from the sky while flying near Mount Rainier in Washington. He described them as looking like saucers that skipped on the water, and when a local newspaper ran with that description, the term flying saucer was created, and has been in use since then. In 1948, the US government had received so many reports of unidentified flying objects that they created Project Sign. The statement that they made was that the Cold War, which had just begun the previous year, could be the cause of unidentified Soviet aircrafts. Officially, or on paper, the government was looking into security threats, which very easily could have just been an excuse. This project was replaced within a year by Project Grudge, and again in 1952 by Project Blue Book. From then until 1962, more than 12,000 sightings were categorized as known or unknown as to their cause. 6% of these events were officially classified as unidentified. After a few more investigations with specialists, it was stated that 59 reports could not be explained with any reasoning, making their origin a complete mystery and open to interpretation. After the number of sightings went down, UFO investigations in the United States by government officials lapsed, or so the public thought. Stated as historical Navy videos, the Department of Defense has recently publicly released a few videos depicting what they refer to as unidentified aerial phenomena. One video was filmed in November of 2004, while the other 2 were filmed in January of 2015. An interview with the pilots featured in the video from the 2004 incident stated that it was a, quote, oblong object about 40 feet long and about 50 feet above the water, end quote. The pilot also stated that it, quote, accelerated like nothing I've ever seen, end quote. Following the release of the 2015 videos, the Pentagon officially stated that they had been working on something called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which had previously been awarded $22 million in funding. That was supposedly from 2007 to 2012. The information about it had only been released in 2017. The only reason official investigations had to come to a close was because funds had depleted. Those sources do state that aerospace threat identification is something that officials work on when they can. Today, it's also known that the governments of Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, Greece, and Sweden keep detailed reports of UFO sightings. It's not surprising, seeing as these countries all have had historically notable experiences with UFOs in the past. What's not known to the public is just how considerable the information these governments have on UFOs is. Understandably, governments don't share information with the public due to safety reasons. It wasn't even known until 2010 that Winston Churchill and Dwight D. Eisenhower had kept an incident involving a strange aircraft a secret because of the possibility that it would lead to mass panic. Near the end of World War II, a Royal Air Force reconnaissance aircraft was getting close to the English coastline when, quote, a strange metallic object matched the aircraft's course and speed for a time before accelerating away and disappearing, end quote. And they weren't going to release any of that information until a man demanded answers in 1999, stating that his grandfather was in the room when Churchill and Eisenhower discussed how to deal with the UFO. It really makes you wonder just how many UFO incidences governments across the world have covered up. The 2 most likely culprits for UFOs are military outfits and nature. Meteors, balloons, planes, and naturally occurring flashes of light can all be easily mistaken for UFOs when seen by the right person. Officially, 90% of all UFO experiences have been classified as known phenomena. So why are we all so willing to categorize our experiences as that 10%? In my opinion, it all goes back to psychology. Psychology has been questioning these widespread events and interpreting them as simply just our brain's way of dealing with certain things. In the later years of his life, famed psychologist Carl Jung published the book Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the sky. This was in 1959 during America's UFO golden years. Instead of debating the existence of UFOs like a majority of books on the subject do, he simply wrote about it from a psychological perspective, diving into its archetypal meaning and significance in the human mind. In it he wrote, quote, "In the threatening situation of the world today, when people are beginning to see that everything is at stake, the projection creating fantasy soars beyond the realm of earthly organizations and powers into the heavens, also into interstellar space, where the rulers of human fate, the gods, once had their abode in the planets. Even people who would never have thought that a religious problem could be a serious matter that concerned them personally are beginning to ask themselves fundamental questions. Under these circumstances, it would not at all be surprising if those sections of the community who ask themselves nothing were visited by visions, by a widespread myth seriously believed in by some and rejected as absurd by others." End quote. With this, Jung was simply just stating that we, as human beings, feel a deep-seated need to look up at the sky and see ourselves as smaller parts of a larger plan, or rather to even question if we are or not. While humans used to believe it was pagan gods who allowed us some control of our lives through acts of sacrifice, the general consensus today in the UFO world is to replace those gods with something different, something closer to the technology that we have today. In Jung's perspective, it doesn't really matter whether UFOs exist, but rather the questions we ask ourselves about our existence here on Earth due to the sightings of those UFOs. If we no longer can believe in Zeus or the Titans of the old age, according to Jung, we will inevitably make up something to help us reason with what's out there in the great unknown. So, are those unexplained aerial phenomena all just something we made up to replace God in our minds, or are UFOs out there? In my personal opinion, I think it's a mixture of both. Just like FBI agent Mulder, I want to believe. To go back to what started this entire episode off, something just seemed strange this past week in my backyard when those lights drifted across the sky. There were too many unexplained variables that made my gut say, something is not what it seems. While we now know that unidentified flying objects are a real thing, with too many sightings of them to completely refute the idea, what's left to do is to find out who those objects are being flown by, and also why the government seems so secretive about them. The only question you need to be asking yourself is this: do you believe? As this episode comes to a close, I would like to thank my listeners for supporting my dream job. Without you, I would just be someone talking into a microphone at 2 a.m. in my parents' basement, like a crazy person. But still, I would love to have more to talk about. Please email me at strangeoriginspodcast@gmail.com and tell me what it is about this week's topic that interested you, your suggestions for future episodes, or even stories of your own experiences with the strange and unexplained. If you would like to help this podcast grow, allowing me to make bigger, better episodes, be sure to click the follow button or even give it a 5-star rating if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. If you're feeling bougie, you can also donate to my Patreon page, which is linked in the description. You can donate any amount, and each tier of donation receives great gifts like shoutouts, stickers, and even exclusive episodes. Or, if you're poor like me and would just like to enjoy more spooky stuff, be sure to follow my Instagram page at Strange Origins Podcast. And if you know of a friend, a sibling, a coworker, or a pet dog who would love to listen to my podcast, send them a link. It would be greatly appreciated. Be safe out there, but more importantly, guys, remember to keep it strange.